So we're continuing with a Fireside Chat, and it's going to be about the future of tech and impact startups in Africa. It's going to be very interactive sessions, so we will have a few polls pre-prepared. So get ready to use Slido on the slido.com of the hashtag Pioneers'18 to participate in the polls. So the main focus will be how startups, investors, corporations, governments, and academia can work together to start and scale startups in Africa. And we have two great speakers to talk about this in our session. The first is Zachariah George, and then we have Aunnie Patton Power. So let's start with the lady. Aunnie, she is a reformed investment banker. She's also the founder of Intelligent Impact and an entrepreneur resident at the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship. She started impact investing back in 2010, where she was with Unitas Capital in Bangalore, and where she had designed financial instruments that were worth hundreds of millions of dollars to generate impact. And she's also a fellow at the University of Cape Town, as well as Oxford, as well as the London School of Economics. Then Zach, he is also a former investment banker who got reformed. He was with Lehman and Barclays in New York and holds a Stanford MBA. He's the co-founder and chief investment officer of Startupbootcamp Africa, which is the leading venture accelerator backed by multiple corporations in Africa. He's also personally an angel investor who has invested in about 15 or more of the top tech startups on the African continent. And previously, he was the head of the Africa investments for UStart, which is the largest network of private multifamily offices in Europe. Good. So much from the introduction of my side. I leave the stage to them. So please welcome with warm applause, Zach and Aunnie.
Thank you very much. Yep. Great. Great. Oh, this is the song you requested.
Yeah, of course.
All right, great. Hello, everyone. We're quite happy to be here. We want to spend a few moments talking about the African tech ecosystem, as well as impact investing. So, Zach, why do you see Africa as the next investment horizon?
Sure.
Opportunity is probably a better word there.
Awesome. So I think as a starting point, let's look at what the world population is today. So the world population today is about 7.5 billion people. And over the next 80 years, the world population is going to hit just between 11 and 11.5 billion people. So that's a net increase of about 4 billion people in the next 80 years. Now, the UN and the World Health Organization predict that about 85 to 90% of that net new 4 billion people will come from the continent of Africa. So by the turn of the century, 1 in 3 people on this planet will live in Africa. And the current state of technology, be it cables, internet, food security, water security, housing, smart cities, does not have the capacity to fuel that. And one of the only ways in which you can solve those problems is through smart technology, be it blockchain technology, artificial intelligence, smart cities. So the opportunity to serve the largest market on the planet will not come from Europe or from the US or from more established markets, but from more emerging markets. And Africa provides the biggest opportunity from a pure access to market perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. And why? So Zach and I both live in Cape Town, which we think is the most beautiful city on earth.
Of course it is.
Why do tech startups come to Cape Town?
So Cape Town has a lot of similarities to San Francisco and Silicon Valley. It's got a very good set of tertiary education institutions like UCT, Stellenbosch, that are comparable to Stanford and Berkeley. It's got a very active corporate government sort of interaction with startups. The corporate venture capital is very unique there. It's got a very similar risk capital ecosystem to Silicon Valley, so lots of very well-established private family offices that do make investments into early-stage startups. And last but not least, you've got a very active accelerator, incubator, venture capital ecosystem. And these form the founding blocks of a mature, innovative ecosystem that brings in money, brings in resources, brings in talent. And it's a concept of open innovation that makes a city like Cape Town a hotbed for innovation. Yeah.
Should we try our first poll? Anyone using Slido? We wanted to ask you about why you pick where you are founded. So when you're picking your company location, what do you consider? I would give you the instructions on how to do it, but I'm not exactly sure. So I think you go to Slido and you use that hashtag. So when you're working with entrepreneurs in Cape Town, what are some of the things that they're considering for why they continue to stay in Cape Town?
So I think, how many of you have actually lived or been to South Africa before? Anyone?
Anyone?
No?
OK, one, two, couple,
Yeah.
all right.
So if you look at what creates an ecosystem for innovation, you need good developers, good designers, digital media, marketing, and you need an ecosystem where the local government supports entrepreneurs through R&D funding, grants, tax subsidies, etc. Have you ever wondered why most of the top innovation ecosystems in the world happen to also have vineyards and really good coffee and are close to oceans and people love their surf and their mountain climbing? It's because it brings people of a certain character together. So Cape Town provides that opportunity to people to come and innovate. So Cape Town is often called the Silicon Cape of Africa, as Aunnie knows. So it's an opportunity where if you can bring people from all across the continent to Cape Town to build products, Cape Town is a very soft landing spot where innovation can then filter across to the continent. Cape Town's little neighbor, Johannesburg, is where all the big corporations in Africa are headquartered. So the largest retailers, the banks, the telcos, the insurance companies are all based in Johannesburg. So from an access to market perspective, it is exceptionally easy, or a lot easier, for startups to scale through large corporates, and we can talk about that.
So we've got a few answers here. Quality of living and size of the target market are quite high, which is interesting if you put those two together, looking at the Silicon Valley. Definitely, I would say I love San Francisco, but from a cost of living and quality of living, that's interesting. So quality is now popped up. And I think that's really important. I've worked in a few different tech hubs in developing markets, and being able to hire the right developers, live the type of lifestyle that you want to, is important. I know we're all slaving away quite a few hours of the day, but it's something that I think is certainly on people's minds, particularly younger developers.
Absolutely.
Should we move to our next poll?
Sure, absolutely.
All right. So the next thing we want to talk about are corporates. So something interesting about South Africa is that it is a very corporate-dominated culture. So a lot of the money for VC, which isn't a lot, comes from corporates, and a lot of the buyouts actually happen from corporates relatively early, buying out, often incubating and then buying out startups. And so it's something that it really definitely influences the culture in Cape Town. So Zach, what have you found? What have been the effective ways that you've engaged with corporates with your startups?
Great question. So just taking a step back, if you look at how Silicon Valley startups and startups in the US have grown in scale, it's very different from a customer acquisition perspective in more mature markets like the Valley in Europe versus in less mature markets like Africa and Latin America and Asia. So one of the key things is, how do you minimize your customer acquisition costs and how do you maximize your customer lifetime value, right? Most of you are startup founders here, so you'd know that. So in Africa and South Africa specifically, if you can access customer data by working with large banks, insurance companies, retailers, and telcos, your route to market is shortened dramatically.
Yeah.
So your cost of customer acquisition reduces quite a lot. So you're not spending millions of dollars on CRM software to get customers. You're using and leveraging networks that the large banks have, the large insurance companies have. So what's critical here, as Aunnie mentioned, corporates in Africa tend to be very acquisitive. So you have a lot of exits in Africa. But those exits happen very prematurely, in a year or 2 years of a startup being founded. But the multiples, the EBITDA multiples, the PE multiples on those deals are very small. We're talking 2, 3, or 4 times earnings. So the way to circumvent that is to work with corporates from a JV perspective, from a licensing perspective, from a commercial traction perspective versus pure M&A. So we've seen over the last 3 years large corporates like Naspers, for example, that is the world's 4th largest internet company after Alibaba, Facebook, Amazon, and Google, is now not looking at just acquiring companies, but rather working with them through what we call POCs, proof of concepts, experiments, and pilots, where corporates need to be more lean, agile, and iterative, and fail fast and fail quick. They can't do that by themselves because it's too risky. And startups need customers. So the startups, it's a marriage made in heaven. Startups work through corporates to get distribution, and corporates are more innovative by working with startups. So that is a big part of, and revenue sharing and branded partnerships are a very key element of making that happen. And it's true for most emerging markets. So.
And I think that one of the things that a lot of the African startups, so I'm in the area of impact as well as early stage tech, but a lot of the startups that we work with have an excellent story to tell. So the social enterprises that are addressing key markets, and oftentimes what they're doing is they're working with market segments that corporates don't know how to access. So for instance, individuals that are in informal markets, which is something that most of the economies in Africa have a majority of individuals that are in informal markets. So that data is not easily available. And so working with some of these startups that are particularly looking at how to engage and work with individuals that are harder to reach and that they also don't understand. And so I think that's something that having the understanding of how individuals act, behave, how they transact is something that corporates really see value in. And we see that a lot. And it's something that I think when you're thinking about potentially partnering or working on the continent, having local partners that understand both political and cultural differences is really important. Yeah.
So on that note, let's now talk about impact.
Yay.
Right, so how do you use, and this is Aunnie's area of expertise. So our next question on Slido, why do corporations, why do governments, why do people like yourselves, investors and entrepreneurs, why do we need to measure impact? Is it a nice to have? Is it a need to have? And how does that context make even more sense in emerging markets? So in your opinion, having done this for most of your life, why do people need to measure impact? And what are some of the metrics that you would look into from an impact measurement perspective?
Okay, so impact, it's this word that you've heard many, many times, and it's oftentimes difficult to define. So we look at a bunch of different things around impact, but really you're looking at how does your product, your service, whatever you're providing actually affect your end users. And I think some of the things that are important to think about when you're thinking about impact is finding ways to do verified data. So historically on the impact side, our impact measurement is significantly inferior to data collection for startups. And this is something that needs to be fixed because the data collection that startups are doing can be incredibly nuanced and down to the end user and verified. So what's happening is there are startups in this space that are specifically helping social enterprises to be able to collect data that looks very similar to any other sort of data that you're collecting as a startup. And I think that's really important. So understanding what consumers of your product are interested in, and then how it affects their lives. No matter what kind of startup you are, that's something that you should know. And understanding the types of purchasing power that individuals have, the needs that they have. And this is where really good impact measurement can be very helpful for a business model, not just for funders. The other thing to say is that the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a set of goals that every country essentially in the world has signed up to accomplish by 2030, is increasingly important on the investment scale. So you're going to be seeing investors starting to ask you, how do you help achieve the SDGs? And having impact data is one way to potentially do that. Now, that's not going to be their first question to you. It's probably not even going to be their 5th question to you. But it is something that is going to start coming up in conversation no matter where you operate. So being able to create data sets that are verified and that are robust and that you can query in a lot of different ways is exceptionally important.
Yeah. And when you measure social impact for enterprises, not just in Africa, but all across the world, one of the things that's very important to address is when you look at impact, how socially responsible companies are funded is almost as important as the benefits of what they do. So most of you are probably familiar with equity and debt and grants and convertible notes. So I'm going to ask our next question here, which is, slide up.
Funding.
That's right. What type of funding structures have you, as investors, as entrepreneurs, considered when you either receive funding for your enterprise or have to make decisions on what you fund and why you fund them? And there are, traditionally, it's been a combination of either straight debt, interest-free loans, development finance, or straight-up venture capital. But there are more instruments that are coming around that are more creative and more applicable to what the founders need and what the ecosystem needs. So, Aunnie, in your experience, what type of funding structures have you seen out there that are more relevant to impact-oriented enterprises?
Yeah, so I've spent most of my career designing financial structures that allow the social and the environmental impact to be evaluated and also be part of how capital is actually spent. So one of the things that's really interesting is when you start to think about you as an organization, and if you're a purpose-driven organization, so part of the reason you exist is to disrupt markets that need to be disrupted, to increase impact, whether it's social, environmental, or economic impact. And so if your funding model says that you need to be very short-term, and you're actually looking at things that are actually longer-term, and that might not measure exactly in an IRR, but you think actually are important in that IRR. And some of it's around risk. Are you treating your employees well? Do you have gender equity? These are things that are externalities, but not really, right? I mean, these are things that are huge risks for startups, for corporates, et cetera. And so the idea around having structures that incentivize startups to think longer term, to act more responsibly, to be more gender equitable, to be more inclusive, these types of instruments can exist anywhere in the world. And we're seeing more and more funders be interested in how their capital can incentivize startups. So you can have things like social milestones where you can have equity buybacks. So a impact investor is interested in you hitting specific milestones around your impact and will actually give you back equity in your company for you to do that. Things like venture debt, where the debt is actually priced based off of the impact you're having. And we see these where the funders actually start to evaluate and say the more impactful you are, we think the less risky you are. So we're willing to change our price of the debt. And having royalty-based financing, this is kind of a newer but very popular in the Valley for a few years, allows organizations and individual investors to be able to get cash out faster, and also can have social and environmental components to it as well. I think what I always tell organizations and students that I work with is, if you understand the rules of finance, you can be very creative with it. And if you're being very creative for a specific end goal, then this is something that you should have that conversation with your funders. And funders are generally open to it.
Oh yeah, totally.
I'm interested that a lot of people have had venture debt. That's great. I think venture debt's a really appropriate mechanism instead of just continuing to do equity rounds ad nauseum. So I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we have just a little bit of time left. Should we do our very last question on accelerators? So this is your area, running an incredible accelerator in Cape Town. So I think startups are getting pickier around accelerators and incubators, are starting to evaluate them more. So what are some of the things that you think that differentiates the work that you're doing, and why organizations want to be involved with Startupbootcamp?
Yeah, so we run the largest accelerator on the African continent, but I think what's important is you can't just create models that copy and piggyback of traditional accelerators. So everyone knows a Y Combinator, 500 startups, and these are Silicon Valley-based accelerators that cater to the market there. What emerging markets in Africa and Latin America and Southern Europe, for example, need is you have to have situations where you can quickly scale enterprises and founders to work with large corporates, like I mentioned earlier, insurance companies, banks, and retailers, to quicken your growth trajectory. So what we do traditionally is because we focus on B2B and B2B2C business models. We pair up our founders of very innovative fintech, insurtech, AI, big data startups, health tech companies, with large corporates. And we reduce their route to market from typically 18 to 24 months down to about 3 to 5 months. And that saves a lot of time, energy, money, and resources for these founders. Of course, an accelerator gives you quality content, so you learn things like growth hacking and financial modeling and digital media and legal, tax, accounting, but that's what any accelerator gives you. But it's very important to also have in emerging market access to really quality mentors that sit on your boards, help you with networks, knowledge, and skill sharing. And the tipping point is the corporate B2B connections. And that is the future of how we will create more Ubers, Airbnbs, Twitters, and Dropboxes, not just out of the Valley, but in Cape Town, in Vienna, in Nairobi, in Rio. And hopefully a talk and this discussion that we have spurs you as entrepreneurs or investors to look above and beyond just your borders into where this massive opportunity in the continent of Africa entails. So feel free to come and talk to both of us.
Yeah, I think we can finish off a little bit if you. I think that's wonderful closing thoughts. So I think there's reason to look beyond borders, but then there's also reason to look at beyond kind of traditional metrics. And I think this is where the impact side is going to be important for all technology startups. So if we're trying to really have this fourth industrial revolution, we can't leave behind as many people as we've left behind in all of the previous industrial revolutions.
Absolutely.
And I just think that if we're reevaluating who holds power, what happens, where revenue goes to, what is created, we can't do that without really thinking about, the entire population. And I think that's, making this revolution more inclusive is something that we should strive to do. And I think it's something that we can do. The types of technology we're working with, like distributed ledger, can be made inclusive, and I think it should be a goal. So I think that hopefully what's happening is there's an amount of investor enthusiasm that will relay itself into dollars for impact, and that's what we're hoping for. So thank you all very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.